Most people think about weapons in terms of power: bigger bomb, stronger missile, more advanced jet. That's how we've been taught to measure military strength for the last 80 years. But there's a number that almost nobody outside a small circle of defense planners ever talks about, and that number might matter more than any missile, any jet, any aircraft carrier. It's a ratio. On one side, a weapon that costs roughly $2,000 to build. On the other side, the interceptor needed to shoot it down, which can cost over $4 million. Read that again, $4 million to stop a $2,000 weapon. Now imagine that math repeated 100 times, 1,000 times, in a single night. That's not a hypothetical anymore. That's already happened over the Red Sea, over Ukraine, over Saudi oil facilities, and the country that built this strategy, refined it, exported it, and is now watching it play out in real time is Iran. Today we're going to walk through exactly how this works, where it came from, why the world's most powerful military has no clean answer for it, and why this isn't really a story about drones at all. It's a story about arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't care how powerful you are. Let's begin. The weapon nobody took seriously. To understand what's happening now, you have to go back to a weapon almost nobody respected when it first appeared. A slow-moving, propeller-driven aircraft, no pilot, made largely from commercial off-the-shelf parts, the kind of components you could find in hobby shops and electronics markets, a simple guidance system, a small explosive payload. On paper, it looks almost laughable next to a modern fighter jet. It flies at the speed of a car on a highway, it has no stealth coating, it shows up on radar like a small, slow blob. For years, Western militaries looked at weapons like this and essentially shrugged. Too slow, too primitive, not a real threat. But here's where things become interesting, because the people building these weapons weren't trying to win a dogfight. They were solving a completely different problem. Not, how do we build the most advanced weapon in the world, but how do we build a weapon so cheap, so simple, and so easy to mass produce that our enemy's expensive defenses become the actual liability? Iran didn't need a weapon that could outfight an F-35. It needed a weapon that could outlast an air defense budget. The export nobody noticed. At first, this looked like a regional story, Iran arming proxy groups across the Middle East. Familiar headlines, familiar reactions, that alone would be significant. But the story doesn't stop at Iran's borders. These same drone designs, or close variants of them, started appearing thousands of miles away, in a conflict most people assumed was purely a contest of tanks and artillery, the war in Ukraine. Suddenly, a weapon that Western analysts had dismissed as a regional nuisance was being launched in waves against power plants, fuel depots, and air defense batteries in Europe. And the pattern was identical everywhere it showed up: cheap, simple, slow, and launched not in ones and twos, but in swarms. Yet the story goes even deeper, because the real innovation here was never the drone itself. It was the strategy behind how it gets used. The strategy of exhaustion. Here's the question that should be keeping defense planners awake at night. What happens when your enemy doesn't need to win a single battle? They just need you to keep spending. Modern air defense systems are extraordinary pieces of engineering. Layered radar networks, high-speed interceptor missiles, split-second decision systems that can track dozens of incoming threats simultaneously. But every single one of those interceptor missiles costs real money, often millions of dollars each, and every battery only carries a limited number of them. Now consider this. If an attacker sends one expensive cruise missile, the defender fires one expensive interceptor. Cost roughly matches cost. That's a fair fight. But if an attacker sends 50 cheap drones at once, drones that cost a few $1,000s apiece, the defender still has to treat each one as a potential threat, because even one slipping through could hit a fuel tank, a radar station, a ship. So the defender fires 50 interceptors at several $1 million each. Let that sink in. The attacker just spent roughly the price of a few cars. The defender just spent the price of a fighter jet. And here's the part that should really concern you. The attacker can build more drones faster than the defender can build more interceptors. It's not even close. This is the strategy. Not destruction through firepower. Destruction through arithmetic. Force the other side into a spending war they cannot sustainably win, no matter how rich they are. Why America's system wasn't built for this. To understand why this is such a problem for the United States specifically, you have to understand what American air defense was originally designed to stop. For most of the Cold War and the decades after, the threat that mattered was the high-end threat. Fast-moving ballistic missiles, advanced fighter jets, cruise missiles built by major industrial powers. So the systems built to counter those threats were engineered to be incredibly precise, incredibly capable, and incredibly expensive. That trade-off made sense because the threats themselves were expensive too. At first glance, this looks normal. Match expensive defenses to expensive threats. Standard logic. But beneath the surface, something else is happening. Iran's drone strategy doesn't try to beat that high-end system at its own game. It simply steps underneath it entirely. Picture a fortress with incredibly thick, expensive walls designed to stop cannonballs. Now imagine an attacker who, instead of bringing a bigger cannon, sends 1,000 people with slingshots, all at once, all aimed at the same window. The wall isn't the problem. The window is. And right now, across the Middle East, the Red Sea, and parts of Europe, that window, the gap between cheap mass-produced threats and expensive precision defenses, is wide open. Who actually benefits? This is where the strategy becomes visible. Iran doesn't need to win a conventional war against the United States. It almost certainly couldn't, and its planners know that. What it can do is make the cost of American power projection in the region unsustainably high, not through one dramatic strike, but through constant low-cost pressure that forces expensive responses again and again. Every interceptor fired is an interceptor that has to be replaced. Every ship diverted from shipping lanes is an economic cost felt globally. Every air defense battery that depletes its stock is a battery that's vulnerable the next night. And there's a second audience watching all of this very closely. Countries far beyond the Middle East. Any nation that can't compete with the United States on aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, or satellite networks suddenly has a blueprint for how a much smaller power can impose real costs on a much larger one. Now the picture starts to come together. This isn't just an Iran story, it's a preview, a working demonstration in real time of how the next generation of conflicts might actually be fought. Not tank versus tank, but spreadsheet versus spreadsheet. The response that's already starting. So is the United States doing nothing? No. Quietly, defense planners have been racing to develop their own version of cheap, lower-cost interceptors, directed energy weapons, lasers, that could theoretically shoot down a drone for the cost of the electricity used rather than a multi-million-dollar missile. New radar systems designed specifically to detect slow, low-flying targets that older systems were never tuned to notice. But here is where things become interesting again. All of these solutions take years to develop, test, and deploy at scale. Iran's approach took years too, but it had a head start, and it's been field testing and refining its designs in real conflicts for years already. Each iteration a little cheaper, a little harder to detect, a little more numerous. The question isn't whether the United States can eventually close this gap. The question is, how much does it cost in money, in ships, in regional stability during the years it takes to get there? What happens next? Here's the long-term consequence that matters most. If cheap drone swarms can meaningfully strain even the most advanced military on Earth, then the old assumption that overwhelming budgets guarantee overwhelming security starts to break down. Smaller nations, militias, and non-state groups around the world are watching this unfold. And the lesson they're taking away isn't subtle. You don't need to match a superpower's budget. You just need to find its most expensive habit and make it repeat that habit thousands of times. That's not a story about one weapon. That's a story about a new era of conflict, one where the balance of power is measured less in megatons and more in unit costs. So let's bring this all together. Iran didn't invent a miracle weapon. What it built and exported was a strategy that turns mass production and low cost into a form of power that traditional militaries struggle to counter, not because they're weak, but because their entire system was built for a different kind of war. The drones themselves are almost disposable. What isn't disposable is the lesson they're teaching the rest of the world about where real leverage now lies. And that brings us to the question worth sitting with. If the future of conflict increasingly comes down to who can sustain a cost exchange longer, not who has the most advanced technology, but who can outproduce the other side at the cheap end of the spectrum, what does that mean for a country like the United States, whose entire strategic identity has been built on having the most advanced technology in the world? If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world.